I'm Larry Walther, and this is PrinciplesOfAccounting.com, Chapter 5. We're continuing with the module on purchase recognition issues for merchandising businesses, specifically focusing this time on freight costs. Freight costs can be very significant. It's not an immaterial cost to consider for many businesses. So in negotiating a purchase and a purchase price, one would typically also negotiate the freight terms, which deal with the place of delivery, when the risk of loss shifts from the seller to the buyer, and who's to be responsible for the cost of shipping. In North America, we typically refer to this as FOB, or free on board point, which refers or represents the place where ownership transfer shifts. So let's see how this works. If the goods are FOB destination, the seller needs to pay to get the goods to their destination. Here's a drawing. Our seller is in New York, is paying the freight company, and the goods are moved across the country to Los Angeles to be received by the buyer. So I'm putting a check mark. Those freight costs are incurred by the seller. If we turn this around and look at FOB shipping point, then the buyer agrees to pay to get the goods to the destination. So here the buyer is paying the freight company, and the buyer is going to record the freight cost on their books. We can have variations of this. We can have FOB shipping point, freight prepaid. In this particular case, the seller is paying the freight company but expects to be reimbursed by the buyer because the terms are FOB shipping point. At the point of shipment, the goods belong to the buyer, as does the obligation to pay for the freight. The transfer of cash from the seller to the freight company and in turn back from the buyer to the seller to reimburse, that's merely an accommodation to the transaction, but again, the freight cost belongs to the buyer. Okay. The terms shipping point and destination are often replaced with actual areas such as FOB New York. Areas can be intermediate locations, for example FOB St. Louis, where we would say if the seller was in New York, we're agreeing that the seller will get the goods to St. Louis, at which point ownership shifts to the buyer at that point. So that's a way of splitting the obligation for the freight. Let's look at the accounting for freight. FOB destination. The freight cost will be incurred by the seller. It's called freight out. It's a selling expense that's to be subtracted from gross profit and arriving at net income. And so let's look at the journal entry here. There, in addition to our $7,000 sale, debit accounts receivable and credit sale, there within that compound journal entry is a debit to freight out and a credit to cash to represent the payment of the freight cost incurred by the seller. The buyer's entry for this transaction would merely debit purchases and credit accounts payable. Nothing is recorded relative to the freight since the buyer has no duty with respect to the freight. If we turn this around and look at FOB shipping point, then we're going to have an $8,000 sale by the seller. They'll record the account receivable and sale. The buyer, in their compound journal entry to record the $8,000 purchase, they'll also record the disbursement of $1,500 for freight costs. If we have FOB shipping point, freight prepaid, it gets a bit more complicated. Here the seller has a $10,000 sales transaction, but they're booking $10,400 in accounts receivable because they've also paid the freight company $400 that they are entitled to be reimbursed for by the buyer. If we look at the buyer's books, the buyer is going to record freight in as a $400 cost, merchandise purchases the $10,000 cost of the goods, and reflect the $10,400 payment, the amount that's due to the seller. Notice that the seller's account receivable corresponds to the buyer's accounts payable. Finally, one question that will come up in your homework is, do I get a cash discount on freight? If I bought goods $210 net $30, I get a 2% discount for timely payment. If I buy $10,000 worth of goods and incur $400 of freight cost, is my discount $200, 2% of $10,000, or is it $208? The answer is it's $200. You're not entitled to a discount on the freight terms.